EMR Setup Complaints Master. The Complaints Master includes medical problems that serve as the basis for the patient's problem list on their face sheet, as well as their history of present illness or chief complaint once the patient has arrived. Typically, the values that are defined here will consist of complaints, symptoms, ailments, or conditions, and are often documented as the reason for the visit or why the patient is being seen. Now, when defined correctly, the complaint master works in conjunction with various system-level properties, as well as the encounter type master, to aid the clinician and the physician in having an efficient, care-driven, and scenario-focused workflow. Now, when it comes to creating the complaints, there are two ways. They can be created at the system level or at the encounter level. Now, both ways do require administrative access to the settings configuration menu. You'll notice here that I am logged in as the administrator. Now, the benefit of doing it at the system level is you are able to define some specific behaviors that will aid in the automation of the documentation so that it goes smoother. And those are based on those care-driven workflows that I was alluding to. If you do it at the encounter level, however, you don't have that functionality available. All you get is a default template that is generic, and then that is going to require more manual intervention by the user. So we will look at both methods. First of all, we're going to look at the system level. Under the settings configuration menu, I'm going to go into my workflow column and choose my top option, complaints. Now, of course, when you first implement Prognosis, you are going to be given a specialty-specific library that will have complaints that are specific to your specialty. So the contents of your specific library will vary. You'll notice here that I have 7 pages, and there are up to 25 per page. So my training environment has approximately 175 complaints. Yours may come anywhere with 50 to 100 or more. I use that term, of course, healthy micromanaging. You don't want too few, but you also don't want too many. However, the benefit of what we're going to cover with regards to the default values that can stem from a complaint greatly helps you with automating your workflow by being as specific as your scenarios require. You'll notice here some of mine have diagnoses defaulting. Some of these have specific templates, whereas some are calling the same template. Obviously, if you have a generic template that's being used in a variety of circumstances, you're going to have a lot less automation at your fingertips. Whereas if you're very complaint-specific, scenario-driven, then you can have a lot of it pre-populated for you. And those are the different options we'll look at. So first of all, I'm just going to click my Add New button to create a new complaint. So I'm going to go ahead and give it a unique name. The system does allow duplicate names, but each template saved will have a unique code in the background. Now notice by default, I already have an HPI template called Basic HPI. Every library comes with a basic HPI template, and that is our system-wide generic default. Now there is a system property that if you have administrative access, you have the ability of changing what that default template is. For instance, in our pain management libraries, they usually have a default template called pain description, whereas in family practice, it might be called basic HPI or general illness. So that is something that you do have the ability of customizing. However, it is a system-wide default, and we'll pick that up a little bit more when we talk about creating the complaints at the encounter level. Here at the system level, however, you do have the option of changing it. So within my drop-down list, I can look at all of my existing HPI templates. Now, creating the templates is covered in a separate video. Since I am dealing here with the respiratory illness, labored breathing, I can look to see if I have one called breathing problems, which I don't. I do have one called bronchitis. If I look down further, I might have one called shortness of breath. So I'm just going to go ahead and choose that one for the time being. Now, these next few defaults you'll notice says none. For my vitals, my review of systems, physical specialty, and social history. Now, if you leave these as none, when the patient is arrived on the encounter, that means that the doctor or the nurse or the medical assistant, whoever is responsible for each of those categories, is going to have to potentially do a search. The template will default to whichever one is indexed in your database first. So if I look here, for instance, under vitals, I actually have 3 different templates. Since the one simply called vitals is first in my index, that will default. But if for some reason the patient that I'm treating needs one of the others, then the medical assistant doing the patient intake will need to change it. That is why it's beneficial to pre-program based on the complaint if you know what template you're going to require, because then that is less manual intervention at the encounter level. So the same thing here with our review of systems. Notice we again have multiple to choose from. Now I do simply have one called ROS. If that's the one I want as my generic, I don't necessarily have to predefine one here. That generic one will be the default on the encounter. But then again, if the doctor really does need one that is specific, he will need to change that. And the same is true with your physical. Of course, with your physical exam, this is going to vary greatly on your specialty as to what kinds of physical exams you have. You may have a normal, abnormal, adult, child, or as we see here, we have a lot of very specific ones because based on the procedure being done, the details of the physical exam have different requirements than potentially a general physical exam in a family practice would. I'm just going to go ahead and choose physical exam. Now, with regards to my specialty template, something unique about the specialty template is you can also default these at the encounter type. And again, that is something that was covered in a separate video for encounter type setup. So you have 2 places where you can decide how you want your specialties to default, whether it's going to be relevant to the overall encounter or to the overall complaint. And incidentally, this complaint itself that I'm creating right now can also be defined as a default at the encounter type level. Now, let's say with regards to labored breathing, every time I have a patient with that complaint, I'm going to do a nebulizer treatment in the office. So I'm just going to go ahead and make that a default template. That way, every time a patient gets arrived with that complaint, whoever administers the treatment doesn't have to spend the time with the mouse pointing and clicking and searching for that template. It'll already be on the encounter. And then same with social history. So again, using the default behaviors, if you have a complaint that is very focused or driven by a specific scenario, and you also have corresponding ROS and physical and specialty templates, then by all means, this is the best way to handle that. If you do, then by choosing the chief complaint of labored breathing on the encounter, the shortness of breath HPI, the vitals, the review of systems, the physical exam, the nebulizer treatment, as well as the social history will all default. Therefore, the documentation and the clinician or provider's workflow will not have to be interrupted by searching for the appropriate template. In a family practice world where things are more varied and you may not have the luxury of having such defaults, then of course, if you leave these to none, the system will automatically define the first one in your database. And if it is the right one, great. If not, then on the encounter level, you will manually spend the time choosing what template you want. That is how it's going to aid you in a more efficient workflow. And along those lines, if you have these pre-populate, there are properties available at the system level that you can have so that the answers actually pre-populate for you as well. And those of you who have specialty practices where you are treating the same things over and over again, and you have a lot of commonalities where it always ends up being the same type of outcome, this gives you an opportunity to very expediently get your things documented by the way you define them, starting with your encounter types and now also with your complaints. The same logic is true of your diagnoses. Now, since we are ICD-10 ready, you'll notice we have both ICD-9 and ICD-10. We have the one master search associated with the ICD-9 field because currently ICD-9 is what is still active. And you can simply go ahead and search for whatever diagnosis you would like to default for your labored breathing diagnosis. And in so doing, you will find that it comes in with an associated SNOMED code as well as an associated ICD-10. The SNOMED is required for meaningful use if you're going to document this on the patient's face sheet as a past medical history or a problem. Meaningful use certification requires that SNOMED code be there. And of course, again, with ICD-10 coming in our near future, You can start using the opportunity here of the crosswalk from ICD-9 to ICD-10 to help yourself in getting educated along those lines. So it's going to automatically come in based on that diagnosis search. The diagnosis, if assigned here as the primary, will automatically populate the doctor's assessment on that encounter. So everything that we're defining here is relevant to an arrived encounter when this HPI complaint is chosen on the encounter. So like during patient intake, if this labored breathing complaint is chosen for the patient's visit, when the doctor goes in or the MA or the nurse, they're going to automatically have these particular templates there. The assessment will automatically have this ICD code assessed. Now you can create a short list here of optional ICDs. So potentially the doctor may say 78605 is the diagnosis 80% of the time when this is the complaint. But the other 20% of the time, there's a few other diagnoses. Sometimes it'll be asthma, sometimes it'll be dyspnea, or whatever the situation is. And he doesn't want to have to spend the time searching a long list, even if he has a preferred list of a couple of hundred frequently used. He knows that for this specific complaint, it's going to be one of 3 or 4 diagnoses. He can come in here and build additional or optional ICDs that will then, I'm just going to choose a few of them here for demonstration, and those will then populate a short list on the assessment, so that if the doctor decides for a visit he does not want 78605, but would rather have 786.9, he can quickly modify that on the assessment without spending a lot of time going through the search. Finally, then we have our assessment and plan. Now, the assessment and plan narrative is attached to the principal diagnosis only. So if for some reason you decide you do not want a primary diagnosis defaulting, many physicians, especially again in family care, internal medicine, where it's not a specialty scenario, don't know the diagnosis until they complete the examination. So they don't like the idea of assigning a diagnosis at the complaint level. So I'm just going to clear that. If you do it this way without an ICD, then the assessment and plan is not going to be available to you. It is only available if you have associated a primary ICD code. And what that is, again, in the common scenarios, those of you who are specialists and you see the same thing over and over and over again, maybe you're pain management and you're constantly doing the same types of injections monthly for the patient, and it's always the same type of assessment and plan. Or podiatry, it's a routine diabetic foot exam, and you don't want to keep retyping it. You can put that default assessment and plan narrative. Notice it has the binocular, as common within prognosis. Wherever we have a master file associated with the data entry field, you have your phrase master, where you can build all of your common phrases and your dictations. If you use Dragon oral dictation, it works, of course, in this phrase as well. Once you've keyed the default values you desire, you simply save it. And now this has enabled my applicable for specialty in the upper right. That button is only enabled once you've saved your complaint. If you are a single specialty practice, you don't need to worry about defining anything under this button. However, maybe you are a multi-specialty practice. You have an OBGYN on staff, family practice, pediatrician, and this complaint is only specific to one or the other of you. Then instead of having all, you could decide that this is relevant only to the allergist or only to the pediatrician. And then the other doctors, when they are the attending doctor on the encounter, they won't have this complaint come up in their search screen. Now, as you notice when I came in here, it defaulted to all. Every time you create a new complaint, the default is all. So you only have to come in here in that scenario when you are in a multi-practice situation and the complaint you're creating is specific for an individual specialty. So that is defining your complaints at the system level. Now quickly to show you how to do it at the encounter level, I'm going to open up an encounter and go to my HPI. And let's say I want to type in chronic breathing issues. And it comes up as no records found. And I want to go ahead and document this. I don't have time to go under configuration and build my template because I want to get the patient treated. Well, if I have the correct security permissions, I will have this plus sign icon. And if I click that plus sign icon, it is going to now add that complaint exactly how I typed it. Notice I used lowercase letters. It created it in lowercase. So for those of you who are rather OCD when it comes to your case sensitivity, and because this is the way it's going to print on your output, on your progress note, if you give this functionality to your users, you want to make sure that you have standards in place where they're entering it correctly, because it saves it exactly as you type it. What this has done now is automatically created an HPI complaint called chronic breathing issues. I can go ahead and add it to this encounter, but notice it's bringing in a generic template based on that basic HPI that is defined for all generically at the system level. So when you add it at the encounter level, you don't get the option of selecting a specific template for any of the categories. So then as the doctor goes through, he's going to have to choose each one. Now, if I go back to configuration real quick, I'll show you that that chronic breathing issues has automatically been appended into my complaint master. And notice that it comes in as basic HPI. Everything is none, none, none. I have no diagnoses, nothing. So there are no default behaviors, but it did allow me to create a generic complaint that is now available at the system level for future use. So in review, when defining the complaints master, it is the base of all patients' problem list and their HPI. This, of course, would be in terms of the reason for their visit or their chief complaint at the encounter level, or their past medical history on the face sheet. It can be created both at a system level or at an encounter level. When building it at the system level, you have the opportunity of adding those default behaviors, which will allow for a precise, care-driven, and focused workflow. That, of course, I would suggest that you have healthy micromanaging and that you create enough but not too many. They should be specialty specific or at least scenario based. You can link them to the encounter type per the scenario, and then you can also define which templates and codes you would like to auto-populate when that encounter gets arrived and that HPI is chosen. You also have the ability of then creating your default assessment and plan narratives based upon the primary ICD if you choose to go that route. Now, several other videos on our library will address with documenting your history of present illness and how these behaviors work into making that workflow easier. That concludes this video within the series. Please click the appropriate link below for your next step. If you'd like to take a quiz, you will receive your results in real time directly on the screen so that you can see how well you've done. If you answer incorrectly, the system will prompt you with the correct response. In addition, a confidential email will be sent to the education team to help us better serve you with our educational offerings. Second, advance to the next video within the series you're currently in. And finally, return to the video library main page. As always, feel free to contact us through the Resource Center or email with any additional questions or comments.